There will be no quick labor board decision on the AFSMCE contract with the state. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Yes, the legislature's gone, but stuff keeps happening. And there are national conventions coming up, and of course, the state budget is always going to be in the background. To discuss it with me today, we have with us Matt Porter, State House Bureau Chief, WCIA-TV. Matt, welcome back.
Thanks, Bernie. Glad to be here.
And Andy Maloney, State House Bureau Chief, Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Welcome to you.
Yeah, thank you, Bernie.
Again, it's good to have chiefs with me. The AFSMCE, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, Council 31, represents about 38,000 state employees, Matt. The bargaining situation, the contract expired they've just been living on an extension since last.
Right. They work essentially without a contract, which means you work on the same contract until you get a new contract.
Right.
That's how most unions work. The negotiations died January 8th. Governor Rauner reportedly, from the union side, walked away from the conversation. AFSMCE says they've continued to make overtures to the governor to come back to the table to discuss. The governor instead has taken his fight to the labor board, saying that there's an impasse. Now, if an impasse happens, just to be clear, then the last best deal on the table, which would be favor the governor, would be the one that unions would have to either accept or go on strike. So this was a big decision by the labor board because governor had asked, I'd like you to just make a decision right away. The people of Illinois need a decision. Let's let the labor board make the decision.
Right, and that's after they've already been before.
Right. This was after there had been weeks of testimony, hearings, witness statements from AFSMCE before an independent judge that was hearing and would give a recommendation to the labor board. The governor's office said, hey, you know what, let's skip that and let's just, we've all submitted written testimony. You have that, look at that, and make a decision. Unions felt this was, a break in policy, that this would basically be undermining the system of having this independent judge who listens to the case and makes a recommendation, which the labor board can then accept or reject. So for the unions, a big victory this week, because that means all that testimony they've given will be at least part of the decision-making of whether or not there's an impasse.
Interesting, and of course they do carry on with just an extension of the contract that they had in the past, and we will see where that goes. Andy, this all kind of fits into what's been a negative relationship between the governor and public sector unions, which he said from the time that he was a candidate in the Republican primary. He really thinks it's a corrupt bargain that people can, through their union organizations, can help people get elected and then negotiate their retirement pay and their benefits. On the other hand, the unions think, there we are. And AFSMCE, in its something like 40-year history in Illinois, has never had a strike before. So this would all be kind of a new thing. So where does this stand?
And that's, I think, that's kind of almost a symbol of how the governor campaigned throughout 2014, and that's kind of how that's almost the framework that he set up his first couple of years in office, is sort of lobbing these criticisms at the status quo. You look at Illinois, obviously a lot of state workers who care about these negotiations and are affected by not only the contracts but the whole budget situation. So, and Chicago, obviously a union town. So the governor came in, blasted not only unions but also what he detailed were or described as entrenched groups such as trial lawyers, and I think that's why it's so unprecedented. We've had Republican governors before, but not ones who came in sort of crusading so heavily against what he's calling the status quo.
Right, and we will definitely see where that goes. The unions would argue that the governor during the campaign was quoted as saying before various groups, before he was governor, if we have to shut things down for a couple of weeks or whatever, then that'll help straighten everything out, which the union clearly takes as he wants us to strike. Whereas the governor, since he's been in went to court to help make sure that state employees got paid when there was no state budget for a year, and says the strike would be terrible, and he just wants to settle this. So you just have, as you said, this conflict ongoing between the union side and the Republican governor.
And the union answer to the governor saying he doesn't want to strike, the unions will say, well, then why didn't the governor support the bills that would have sent this to independent arbitration? Because, for example, there are public safety employees of AFSMCE that cannot strike. They cannot go on strike. In exchange for that, they're willing to go to allow independent arbitrators,
binding arbitration,
binding arbiter to decide the contract and take it out of the hands of the governor and the union. That's something that was proposed several times in the last year and a half, and that's something that the governor soundly rejected, said it would end up costing the state $800 million extra dollars.
Yeah, well, he actually said $3 billion over the life of the 5-year contract, because of what he thought was proposed from the other side and what raises might be there.
Right, but again, the unions say, well, if you really don't want to strike, that's how you avoid a strike. That's what public safety employees do. But again, the governor instead has tried to call for this impasse, which would essentially give him an edge in putting the last best deal forward.
Yeah,
and I was going to say, it's just a good point to bring up the state employee pay case. A lot of folks believed that was sort of the thing that kept budget negotiations sort of stalled and in limbo with consent decrees, court orders, kind of keeping things going while the legislators.
You're saying the fact that a judge said that state employees need to continue to be paid?
State employees could continue to be paid.
Right.
And it also just shows sort of the positioning that the administration has had to do, because as they were coming in and saying, we're going to make all of these changes to the union structure and end this corrupt bargain, he also kind of went back and said, well, I'm making sure that you guys are continuing to get paid.
Right.
In the meantime, also sort of laying the blame at Attorney General Lisa Madigan's feet and saying she wants to make sure that you don't get paid.
Yeah, which we don't even know if that's the case, but there was thought that she could go to court to say without an appropriation they shouldn't be getting paid, but she never has done that at this point.
And by keeping the state running for the last year without a budget, the governor sort of has achieved some of his goals. His goals was to cut and trim the fat from the state, and what we're seeing is in all levels of places that were not funded, like higher education, autism funding, other social services, they're all essentially getting cuts to their 2016 budget when you look at the stopgap bill. Colleges have not received their full funding. They've received cuts of anywhere between 10 and 35%, depending on which university and et cetera. And so by keeping the state running, as Andy was saying, it's sort of allowed the governor to make deep cuts to some areas without actually physically having to write a budget that writes that cut into place.
Right, and of course the legislature just within the last 2 weeks, right at the end of June, passed the stopgap budget, a full year budget for elementary and secondary education, K through 12, and a half-year budget for most of everything else in state government, with some programs still not getting everything they want or funding, but that just is partial. Everybody says it's partial. And what it doesn't include, they're using money that is in various funds or that just happens to be usable. But what it doesn't do is fill a multi-billion-dollar gap in how much money is coming in with our lower taxes than we used to have just before, because the individual income tax was reduced right at the beginning of 2015. And so they're going to have to pass some new revenue in January, but the governor won't do that without his turnaround agenda reforms, which brings us back to his conflict with the Democrats who run the legislature.
People are also talking about the stopgap bill, and I think it's a thing to make clear. People hear a stopgap bill get us through December. It, in a lot of cases, doesn't really do that. What it does is it funds 2016 so that all these organizations that were going to stop their services can continue through December, but a lot of the stopgap bill is paying for last year's expenses that weren't paid for, rather than really paying for the new stuff.
And one example of that is the Monetary Award Program grants, MAP grants, which go to more than 100,000 college students. It's usually around $4,000 that they get. And the legislature passed the appropriation to pay for last year's, but the new fiscal year, which began July 1st, there's not funding for that yet.
And one of the things that they were very clear about when they passed that, and I think as you alluded to, they're not really touching some of these court orders in terms of how much those are paying out. They were very purposeful in not affecting those. And so what you have, I think, is those added up to something like $14 billion, $8 billion of that being Medicaid. And like you said, those are sort of being paid at the rates that were in effect in 2015 with the higher income tax. And as we've gone along and not sort of replaced that receding tax, the bills have started to pile up more.
The longer we wait, the higher that tax or those cuts are going to be when they finally have to do it.
And let's take an example. I think, Matt, you've done a story on autism funds.
Right. This week we looked at autism funding because that has been a high-profile social service. It basically got zero funding for 2016 during the budget stalemate. Now it's getting about $4.2 million for 18 months. The autism program during a single year usually gets $4.3 million. So essentially, when you look at it, it's about 65% or a 35% cut to programs. So when I spoke to people in the Hope Institute here in Springfield, they were very cautious to say, yes, 10 out of 14 clinics have closed. You can't expect those clinics to reopen because, one, we aren't getting full funding. Two, a lot of those clinics where people have closed, people have gone away, people have left, and you can't just turn the lights back on. One thing they do hope for is people who have been cut out of autism programs because they're on Medicaid will be able to go back to their clinic, like here in Springfield, and get services. I spoke to one mother who had been off the services. She actually also worked at the clinic, and she had been laid off, plus her son no longer got autism care. And sure enough, in this past year, he was hospitalized, only the second time he's ever had to be hospitalized. And while she says she can't say it's because of the lack of programming, certainly had he had those services, it would have helped. And so a lot of people who are on Medicaid hope that at the very least this money will allow them to go back to clinics and get services for their kids.
And just to add to that, I think that's one of the more important, more perceptive points about this temporary budget is that you've done reporting on it. Our colleague and sometime host Jamie Dunn also did a great story for Illinois Issues on this. But you can't just go pass the bill and go right back to the way things were beforehand. I mean, one example is MAP grants. There was a Student Assistance Commission poll, I think, that found 1 in 7 students who rely on those were thinking that they may not even be able to go back to school and finish their degree.
Thousands of students not finishing college, perhaps, or not going back for the next year.
Exactly.
And the people who say they're not going to go to college in Illinois.
Right.
We were with the higher education officials in May when they said less people are applying for MAP grants, which means likely a lot of students that would have applied for schools out of state.
There is that. Well, the governor is still saying you can't just pass, in his words, a massive tax increase. And even when Mike Madigan, the Speaker of the House, had at one point months ago mentioned maybe we should go back where we were, which is 5%. The Republican machine, basically, the Republican Party, the governor's office, they were all attacking Mike Madigan for saying that would be a massive tax increase. And yet, the comptroller says if Leslie Munger, who's a Republican, if we're going to fill the budget gap, we're going to have to get new revenue. The governor knows we're going to have to get new revenue, but they haven't specified it. And the governor has been out on basically the campaign trail again after the stopgap budget passed. He was in Peoria, I think Galesburg, talking about things. In one of the interviews, he said, Andy, that I'm new here. I've only been here 18 months, and the Democrats have run everything for 30 years. What's wrong with that comment?
I obviously, without saying it, perhaps he was only referring to the legislature, but you need to specify that there were,
Many
Republican governors.
Jim Thompson, Jim Edgar, George Ryan. You had the president of the Senate was Pate Phillip for part of that time, and Speaker Madigan was not Speaker for 2 years because there was 2 years in the mid-'90s that Lee Daniels, after the 1994 Republican sweep of the nation in the Newt Gingrich, boy, that's a name we might hear again, in the Newt Gingrich
vice presidents.
Contract with America year, there was a sweep of republicanism, and the legislature went out full GOP for 2 years.
Right. So you would have to, for that to, have traction, that statement to be totally 100% on point, you would have to specify, well, the legislature has certainly been under Democratic control for a while now. And I think, he's saying that without trying to get into the details on the campaign trail, so to speak, about what the legislature is. He's being very specific and pointed and criticizing Mike Madigan, who is a person that a lot of people statewide know, even if they don't know a whole lot necessarily about the legislature. So I think that's
Yeah.
the strategy. But there have been some pockets of
Go ahead,
Republican
well,
influence.
we talk about the tough choices that need to be made, and I think, the Paul Simon Institute put out a poll that shows the problem isn't necessarily our politicians; it might be the voters, because
This is the Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University,
yes,
named after
and
Paul.
and this was shown that voters want lots of government services. They want it to be strong. They want to get all their bread and butter, but at the same time, they want their taxes to be very low. And honestly, that's a mixed message to send to anyone, because there's one thing that you cannot do, which is provide strong services that everybody's accustomed to and keep taxes, or at the very least, you can't cut the taxes drastically, which is what's happened, and then that's why we've been thrown into this chaos. So I think we want to say, well, the Republicans and Democrats, they're completely against each other, but the voters too are having sort of a bipolar type moment where they're in one hand they want lower taxes, but on the other hand they want strong services. You can't do both.
Well, there is always this, and Jim Edgar is one person who, when he ran for governor in 1990, there was a question. There had been a temporary increase in the income tax by 0.5%, and he wanted to keep. I think it was at least part of it. Maybe it was the whole 0.5%. And he ran on that. Neil Hartigan was the Democrat who ran against it, but Edgar at that time convinced voters we're going to need the money for schools and cities, and it ended up staying, and it won. I guess we should mention that Jim Edgar has been put in an interesting light based on a story in the Sun-Times that came out over the weekend, that he is now part of a company that is, I guess, one of 5 companies that are allowed by the state to give state vendors who aren't getting their state payments advance payments, and then they get like a cut and the interest when the money comes through. I don't know, does that take anything away from Jim Edgar's, the white horse from which he has been speaking, that Governor Rauner should drop the turnaround agenda and do the budget first and then go for your other items later?
I think it certainly shows maybe a little bit of a conflict of interest there. I think.
On the other hand, what Jim Edgar says is, well, if the budget, I'm arguing that they should solve the budget, then this company makes no money. On the other hand, it's just kind of interesting that he's involved in this.
He tried to, at least in the article, I think he tried to portray it as, well, this is a necessary service that has come up because so many places are struggling, and this is not something he would want to see happen, but it's necessary. And I think about, I was just at the prison out in by Jacksonville, where they were threatening to turn off the water in that area, and the board was swayed not to turn the water off when they were told there's a company that will loan them the cash, and all they'll want is the interest off of it. Some of the committee members were concerned, well, how much fees and everything are they going to rob from us? And they were like, well, no, they're essentially going to take the interest that you would have gathered, but they'll give you all the cash you need right now. And it's becoming necessary for a lot of municipalities and places to have a service like that.
Well, I remember when there were budget impasses in the past in Springfield years ago. I remember when there was a credit union that was making loans at no interest or something to state employees because they knew they would get their money eventually. Nobody's that sure about how soon it will come now, but at least these companies are making some interest off it. Kind of interesting. We talked about Paul Simon, and there was a big loss in kind of the political history of Illinois. Another person, Abner Mikva, passed away this week. Andy, he actually represented Evanston, my hometown, for a time in the 70s, but he was a member of the legislature and Congress, and he was a federal appellate judge, and he was, I think, White House counsel or an advisor to President Carter, was it?
Yeah, I think so. And this is a guy, as you note, that was at sort of the highest level of each branch of government. He also clerked for a U.S. Supreme Court justice and could have wound up at the Supreme Court himself. He was the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit. He was also, I think, really one word for him that a lot of people have sort of been using is like a luminary. He seemed to know all of the the talent and the up and coming public servants, especially on the Democratic side. He was gave advice to President Obama.
Yeah, President Obama put out a statement upon his death at age 90, by the way, which was very, several paragraphs clearly written by the president himself.
And he's known, I think, maybe to people who don't recognize the name will recognize the saying, we don't want nobody
sent,
when he tried to start up in politics at a young age in Chicago.
Right. And there's somebody named Milton Rakow wrote a book about Chicago politics and patronage, and that was the title of his study or his book. We don't want nobody sent or something like that.
Right, exactly.
Because that was in the era of kind of the first Mayor Daley and folks like that, who, if you didn't have a political sponsor, you couldn't get anywhere. And Mikva was like, I'm going to try to be clean. And I think his reputation all the way through his career was that he was a straight shooter.
Yeah, it's held up. And you mentioned the Paul Simon Institute. This is somebody that we also see as sort of hearkening back to a more genial time in politics, and this was another guy that had that reputation.
Right. And just on that, there was something called the Mikva Challenge, which is a way for young people to get some political training and lure them into, or help them get into the political process, which he is a continuing program, which I think is part of the legacy of Abner Mikva, for those who would remember him or whatever. But he did serve in Springfield some, but I think it was back in the 60s, so it's been a long time. There's another guy who came up in the political world in a different ways, named Donald Trump. We've heard of him. He was in Washington this last week to meet with members of Congress. I think it was House and Senate separately. Matt, he and Mark Kirk haven't been getting along, and Mark Kirk didn't go to that meeting, our U.S. Senator from Illinois, who says he won't go to the convention and won't vote for Trump.
No, I think the relationship between Donald Trump and Mark Kirk is about as cold as you can get, and that would be putting it politely. Donald Trump is someone who does not like people who come out against him, especially if they were theoretically on his team or supposed to be on his team. He gets offended pretty easily, and I think he was upset by Senator Kirk's decision to back away from Trump during one of his controversial comments, which he's had many more since. And so, that's strong language from Donald Trump. For voters, though, who there are a lot of people down here anyway who agree with Donald Trump. They dislike Mark Kirk, and they dislike him even more that he's turned against the Republican presidential nominee. That's from people I've spoken to who are Republicans down here. The thing about Donald Trump is you wonder how many moderates can he alienate before he's only going to have such a small cluster of voters. Because, Joni Ernst pulled herself out of the VP state.
U.S. Senator from Iowa.
U.S. Senator from Iowa. And also Senator Bob Corker said, I'm not going to, they both, after visiting with Trump just a couple days earlier, seeming like it might be a VP audition, you wonder how many, because even Ernst was seen as pretty conservative. She had that famous ad where she was going to make the congressman squeal like a pig. So not necessarily
as long as you don't get specific, there we're better off.
Right. Okay. But so you wonder, who is he going to have left in his faction? And you talk about Mark Kirk not going to the convention. A lot of Illinois.
Well, Bruce Rauner, who says he's the head of the Illinois Republican Party, although he's not going.
And there'll be a number of others. You wonder what the convention is going to look like. I start to think that Donald Trump is going to be very much like Goldwater in 1964, where you really have this right-wing part of the party that's in control and in the driver's seat, and the moderates seem to be stepping away.
Yeah, well, but a lot of talking heads on television have not been right when predicting what happens with Donald Trump, so we see what happens.
Yeah, and just he says also that he believes he'll win Illinois. Of course, most national candidates will say they'll win, and they're confident, but it would be a long odds, I think, in a state that usually votes Democratic.
I think Donald Trump was in Massachusetts at one point and said, everybody in Massachusetts loves me, they're great, I can do really well here. I mean, we saw him campaigning in California doing that. Yeah. So Donald Trump is going to be in every state, and he's going to say he's going to win every state. We'll
go. And I know just for Springfield itself is divided into 2 congressional districts. Rodney Davis of the 13th congressional district says he's going to the convention because he thinks it's his responsibility. He was in a group that met with Trump in Washington. I heard him in a radio interview say that he thinks Trump we need him, he's doing good, he'll keep Hillary Clinton out of the White House. Darren LaHood represents the 18th congressional district. He's from Peoria. And he has said, that he's okay with Trump, even though he was a Marco Rubio guy in the primary. But he's not going to the convention because he thinks he can do more here. So he's one of our Congress people that isn't going.
Doesn't want that.
I think it's only fair to mention that Hillary Clinton had an interesting week, and you can look at it as a positive or negative. When James Comey, the head of the FBI, came out and said, we are not going to charge her for using a private server for her emails, but she acted carelessly, very carelessly. And then there was a House Republicans, well, there was a House hearing about this with Comey, and the Democrats were saying this is all political theater to help Trump and to try to hurt Hillary Clinton, and the Republicans were all saying, oh, she did a terrible thing and she should have been charged. Where does this go in Illinois? Are we just such a blue state now that none of this talk matters that much to Illinois?
It's going to matter in the down races, This is going to, I think Hillary Clinton with Chicago is going to probably win the state, but I think in the down races, it's going to be really interesting, the down the ballot races, especially between northern and southern Illinois.
Right. And Mark Kirk, Tammy Duckworth for U.S. Senate.
Right.
And I think regardless of whether they support Trump or not, there are people who just believe that the system, they have antipathy for the system itself, and this is a symbol that people in power can't be trusted.
Well, with several candidates on the ballot, Trump won the Illinois primary, but none of the members of the Republican State Central Committee were Trump delegates at the beginning. So it's just an interesting thing. We're more of a moderate Republican state, even when Republicans have won major offices, and Trump has not been that moderate tone.
I've asked the Republican leadership and said, are you worried about a Trump effect, possibly sending more Democrats into the House? And they've said to me, well, we're thinking the Trump effect is going to give us a hand in all those downstate races.
Southern Illinois, perhaps?
In Southern Illinois, where there are still Democrats, and they think they can take those seats.
Interesting. Just before we finish up, I should say that in the 13th Congressional District, Rodney Davis, interesting thing, David Gill ran against him in 2012 as a Democrat, running as an independent this year. He's had his petitions challenged, and it sounds like he might not have enough. I'm not sure. That has to go before the State Board of Elections. And there's a guy named Mark Wickland from Decatur who is the Democratic candidate. Well, Mark Wickland got a call from U.S. Congressman Bill Foster from Northern Illinois, and so did David Gill. Apparently people were trying to work a deal to get Wickland to drop out and Gill to become the Democratic nominee. He'd have to be appointed. But Wickland wouldn't go. It didn't happen. So Rodney Davis now is going against Mark Wickland. Looks like somebody saw an opportunity because David Gill almost beat Rodney Davis in 2012. But that one-on-one matchup apparently will not happen. With that, we're just about out of time. Matt Porter, Andy Maloney, thanks for joining me. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.